rate senators and members of the House on their voting records. Two of the most prominent over the years has been the ADA, it was a liberal group rating senators on their records, how liberal they are, and then the ACU has done the same for conservatives. Well, I flipped one of them and combined them to create an index from 0% liberal to 100% liberal for roll calls in 2006 and 2007. And actually, I have up here, we may want to distribute this at this point. Or I'll make it available for you if you'd like to take a look at it. I've put together a quiz based on the issues that are actually used in these ADA and ACU ratings. So you could actually see what instead of just talking in general terms about liberalism and conservatism, when rubber meets the road, what were they voting on and how did they differ? So I put together a set of, I think, 16 questions for the Encyclopedia Britannica's blog site that looked at this. But what's important here is that McCain is almost perfectly positioned between being a moderate and a conservative. A perfect conservative would be 0. Perfectly moderate would split his votes 50-50 between liberals and conservatives. McCain's at 24. Obama is almost as far to the left as it was possible to be. He's 95% liberal. Now, if elections are decided in the middle, even though the middle's shrinking, that should be a distinct advantage for Senator McCain. And it's probably one of the reasons why he was not simply blown out of the water at this point by the retrospective evaluations, why he went into the conventions pretty much tied with Senator Obama. On bipartisanship, we have Congressional Quarterly rates how often you vote with your party. Sort of the opposite of that would be how often you were acting in bipartisan terms, and McCain does much better than that. Obama, most of the time, voted with his party. McCain oftentimes did not. And so, again, if voters are looking for this bipartisan, pulling together kind of leader, that should be an advantage for Senator McCain. So, totaling up these 6 components, what we see is 4 of them lead to a close election. 1 should predispose this to an Obama victory, 1 to a McCain victory. I think that's the reason why we might have expected early on this to be a very close election. So this brings me to the forecast. My forecasting model is a fairly simple model. It really amounts to a sophisticated reading of the polls, taking into account their historical relationship between the polls and the vote. So what I did was I looked at the Gallup poll at different points in the campaign in elections going back to 1948, starting in June, July, August, before the conventions, after the conventions, and so forth, and looked at how the polls were related to the votes at those times, and also took into account the economy, the sort of the contemporary context of the election. The track record has been pretty good. The mean out-of-sample error has been 1.6. In actual practice, it's been a little bit over between 2 and 2.5% of the vote. That's better than the National Election Study, by the way, that measures the vote after the election. So 2 months in advance of the election, the errors in my forecasting model are smaller than the National Election Study's errors, and it's just a little bit higher than the last Gallup poll done. So 2 months out versus the last Gallup poll, the model does just about as well as the last Gallup poll. And the reason for this is you can get a sense of this in a general way by just looking at when candidates who were ahead in the polls went on to win the election, or when the candidate who was ahead in the polls actually lost the election. You can see in June, the front-running candidate, the candidate who was ahead in the poll, out of the last 15 elections going back to 1948, the June poll leader won 8 times and lost 7 times. about the same as a flip of the coin. June polls mean nothing. Gets a little bit better in late July. By the time the conventions are over, they're actually fairly accurate, or they have a pretty good record anyway. Out of the 15 elections, the poll leader after the convention won 12 times and lost 3 times. The 3 losses were Tom Dewey in 1948, Richard Nixon, who just barely had a lead in 1960, and Jimmy Carter, who had just had a small lead after 1980 conventions. The early September polls, and usually historically there's been some gap between the conventions and the early September reading. It's 13 wins and 2 losses. Late September, 14 wins and 1 loss. So you can see that by September, early September, we can really get a pretty good read on, and we don't do much better even in October and November than we do in early September. This is a little bit fine-tuning that analysis. This looks at the average error, average absolute error between the polls, again, over these 15 elections going back to 1948, at the different times in the election year, from June to November, and the vote. So we're looking at how, if you accepted the polls as a literal forecast, how off would they have been on average? And you can see, again, June polls do terrible, 7 points off, plus or minus 7. That's a pretty wide gap. As you get closer to the election, it gets a little better. But even the polls right in early November, the first week in November, they're still not very good. The regression only. So I take the regression models, look at the historical relationship between the polls and the vote. Essentially, it discounts the lead. It indicates how much you should discount the lead of the poll leader at different times in the campaign. And you can see that the average error has dropped quite a bit over that time and improves in each instance over just accepting the polls as a literal forecast. Now, if you add the economy in, the second quarter growth rate in the economy, you can see that it, again, improves at each point and basically bottoms out in early September. And that's the basis of my the forecasting model. I've also added a second model because in response to the parties pushing up their conventions later on in the season, because that could contaminate the early September polls by the convention bump. So I have really 2 models. One looking at the early September preference poll and the economy. You can see that the statistical, I won't get into too much of the statistics here, but it's about 90% of the variance explained by those 2 indicators. The mean out-of-sample error is a 1.6 percentage point. So it looks like a fairly strong model. The convention bump model uses the pre-convention poll, the net convention bump. And what's important here is there's a greater discounting. Less of the net convention bump survives to the election than just the poll itself. And so, again, that's sort of a kind of a safety net model because of the conventions. If you plug in the values for this year, it suggests McCain should get 52.7% of the vote in the basic model. And if you look at the convention bump model, again, this is just going through the math of the formula. The convention bump model suggests that or indicates that he should get 52.2%. Now, I should note that this is out of sync with all of the other political science forecasting models. All of the other models, this is coming out in the current issue of the October issue of PS from the American Political Science Association,